All right, Jay Watts here, founder and president of Merely Human Ministries. This is continuing our Q&A videos, our series of videos based on the idea of questions that we get after we give talks at high schools or colleges. The questions are all fairly similar. The audiences ask the same questions. I even joke with people usually in the same order. One of the questions that we'll get are challenges that we'll often get. And I can remember a young man giving me this challenge last year at a high school in the Connecticut area, I believe, where he stood up and he said, "You'll never end abortion. You'll never stop it. All you will do is force us back into the back alleys, force women back into back alley abortions." How do you respond to that? And I explained to him, first of all, that's really two objections. So let's look at the two objections separately. Number one, that it's an illegitimate goal to try to end abortion because we never will end abortion. I think they misunderstand what people like me are trying to do. I'm not under the impression that I'm going to wipe abortion from the face of the earth. What I'm trying to do, and I'm in a much more limited capacity in what I do, I'm just trying to make the case that abortion is immoral and to convince people that it's morally wrong choice by using science and philosophy and appealing to the arguments to answer the question, what is the unborn? But on the same token, we'll never end murder. We'll never end rape. Those are both illegal and they're still there. Child abuse is still happening in our culture all of the time. There's any number, stealing. All of these things are things that are illegal in our culture, but still exist. And I don't think it would be reasonable to say, well, let's strike the laws from the books, because the laws aren't a false belief that we will end it or eradicate it. What the laws are doing for us is trying to limit evil as best we can. We're using the tools of government available to us to create a culture that best limits those evils, recognizing that insofar as we will always be in community with men, people will do evil and other human beings will do evil against each other, and we'll never be able to stop it, but we can limit it as best we can. And so in pursuing a culture that, as I mentioned earlier in the video, rejects abortion as immoral and accepts laws that reflect that judgment, the goal then is to limit abortion as much as possible, not to eradicate it or eliminate it. And the idea that we can't is not a reason to not make the case against it. But the second objection is that it will force us back into back alley abortions, and that any number of women die. Depending on who you're talking to, the number can get quite large. 5,000 to 10,000 is a number that is knocked around a lot. People will just say that there's thousands of women that were dying every year of back alley abortions. Now, let's say this, there's multiple problems with this. The first one is the first problem that people make when they're talking about abortion, is they presuppose the inhumanity of the unborn. Now, first, before we talk about that, let's take a moment and recognize, as Joseph Della Pena wrote in his book, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, as long as women have been getting pregnant, it is axiomatic that there will be women that are so desperate not to be pregnant that they will do dangerous and terrible things to themselves to end that pregnancy. There's no way around that. It is just a truth of the existence of humanity, that as long as we have existed and as long as women have been getting pregnant, there have been women that are so averse to being pregnant, they're willing to do dangerous and horrible things to themselves and risk a great deal to end that pregnancy. But the first mistake I said that we make when talking about this and addressing this issue is that we assume that the unborn are not human in the same way that you and I are. We presuppose their inhumanity. How do I know that? Well, if the unborn are human in the same way that you and I are, and we have the same basic duty and obligations to them that we have to any other human being, not the least of which is just to not kill them, then what this argument is advocating is that one category of human beings ought to be free to kill another category of human beings, another group of human beings, to protect themselves from the consequences of their actions. If the unborn are human, what we're saying is that this group over here should be free to kill 1 million in the United States alone of these human lives over here to protect themselves from consequences of actions that they just don't want to face. Well, Where would we ever accept that argument under any other circumstances? Never. We're never going to tell another group of people they're allowed to kill them. Now, if the argument is, well, they're just not human in the same way that you and I are, well, that's the argument that has to be made. They have to demonstrate the difference. They have to answer the question, what is the unborn? But to just say that back alley abortions and all these women dying would be a terrible thing that we can't allow. Now, the question then becomes, the second problem isn't just the presupposition that the unborn are not human, but it's a mistaken history. The number of women that were dying from back alley abortion. Now, every single woman who died would be an individual tragedy, an individual independent tragedy among that group, that whatever that number is. So this isn't to dismiss the importance of people dying, or this isn't to dismiss the desperation that these people felt, but it's to recognize that the numbers that we've been offered are vastly inflated when you try to look up the statistics and find out what actually happened. Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who was one of the people working for NARAL to try to promote legal abortion in the United States, said that they often threw around the number of 5,000 to 10,000. They knew it was false. The only number that I can find that will tell you the number of abortion-related deaths in 1972, the year prior to Roe v. Wade, is a statistic given by the CDC. And I think it says a total of 63 women died from abortion-related deaths in 1972, according to the CDC. Now, let's say that number is greatly, way too small. It's way too conservative. What are we going to add to it to get us to a place where we recognize that you're still asking and balanced to be able to kill 1 million people, 1 million human lives through the practice of elective abortion in order to protect what number of women from the terrible consequences of a desperate decision? If your argument is they're not human, you don't need the justification of women dying in back alley abortions. Because if they don't matter, then you no more need to justify this morally than you need to justify tooth extraction, as Greg Koukl says. So if you're using the justification of back alley abortions and women dying, it has to counterbalance the loss of life or the things that are going on with a valuable human life that's being lost, a moral consideration that has to be taken. And that moral consideration is we have created a society where around 1 million in the United States, and that's coming down from where it has been, about 1.3 million for several years, about 1 million human lives are being destroyed through the practice of abortion. And in order, under that justification, to protect 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 women from the terrible consequences, we can both recognize that it's a tragedy when someone does something desperate without empowering them to do another wrong thing in order to avoid that. And I think it was Greg Koukl that once said too, that we should push back a little bit against the idea that we are forcing people to make a particular moral choice by creating an environment that does not condone abortion or rejects abortion as a moral choice. That doesn't force people. We're not making them do something. They're choosing to do something in their desperation. They're choosing to take an action that has been judged as immoral in this particular argument or case by enough people in society that they're willing to accept laws that limit abortion and that make access to abortion more difficult. So we can both embrace the empathy and understanding how desperate these situations are and that women do terrible things when confronted with this, and not accept the idea that they should be free then to kill their offspring at the number of 1 million per year every year in the United States to protect that number from the terrible consequences of that decision. If the unborn are not human, that's the argument that they need to make. But if their argument is that they are something worthy of moral consideration, but there are overwhelming justifications that allow this to happen, and they appeal to the idea of back alley abortions, well, there just is no justification and no other area where we would accept that argument, where we would tell this group of human beings, you are free to kill as many of that number of human beings as you feel necessary to protect yourselves from consequences that you are desperate to avoid. Jay Watts, Merely Human Ministries.